Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here at the Center for American Progress for, I think, what will be a fantastic and extraordinarily timely discussion. I have to say it's a little bit as if we're having a think tank summit this afternoon. We have the heads of several prominent institutes of research and analysis in the United States are brought together really by Vuk Jeremic in order to celebrate the launch of the latest edition of Horizons, the Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development, which is something that he created and that three of our folks here today actually contributed to this edition. Before we get started, I want to say a couple of words about Vuk and this publication. Vuk Jeremic was the foreign minister of Serbia, and he's somebody with whom I've personally had a great deal of differences over the years. I mean, most prominently, he was Serbia's passionate advocate for why Kosovo should not be granted independence, while I and the United States were on the other side of that issue, and that actually embodies why it's so important to see what Vuk has gone on to do, because you have to remember that he was a founder of the Serbian resistance, that he was somebody that believed in a democratic future for Serbia and the rest of Eastern Europe, and for a future that was really based on integration, on how countries would work together. And when he finished up his tenure as foreign minister and ended his stint as the Secretary General of the UN General Assembly, he went home and he created something that was a little audacious. It was to say that Serbia is going to have this journal that is going to compete with the likes of Foreign Affairs. And what do you know? He actually did it. So the chairman of my board and the president of the Center for American Progress are both featured in the current edition. There's copies out on the table there, and I hope you guys will take them. Ivo Dalder is as well. Ambassador Dalder is one of our panelists today. So our little think tank summit has the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the Center for New American Security, the Brookings Institution, the most important, Center for American Progress, and Vuk as president of the Center for International Relations and International Development in Serbia, which is a place that believes that you can't disconnect security from diplomacy and politics, that we have to figure out integrated solutions to complex global challenges. Many of you may know that Vuk is a candidate for UN Secretary General, but he's more importantly was the president of the Serbian Tennis Federation. I don't know if he can take any credit for Djokovic's success in that regard, but he's been a true leader for his country, and I think provides a great example for how we should all embrace finding common solutions to the complex challenges we face today. So I'm very grateful that he's here, and I'm extraordinarily honored that we are going to kick off today with Senator Tom Daschle. Senator Tom Daschle is the chairman of the board for the Center for American Progress. More importantly, and with no need of introduction, he's one of our great leaders and statesmen, and somebody who has dedicated his life to public service probably from before he was first elected to Congress, I believe in 1978. Senator Daschle is a leader in areas that people know about and talk about: healthcare, climate, business. But he's actually been involved in every major issue to face the United States for a good 40 plus years. I can't think of no one better to kick off this discussion than Senator Tom Daschle. And I'm going to keep myself brief, as I promised, and welcome him to the podium and thank him very much for being such a great friend and supporter of the center and for being such a great leader for our country. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoy.
Vikram, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction, and thank you for your warm welcome. And let me welcome all of you as well. We have a standing room only crowd, literally, and I think it goes to the importance of the issue and the quality of the panel. And so I'm very pleased to be a part of it, and salute Nira in particular, our extraordinary leader here at CAP, for all the work she's done, not only in this, but so many of the things that CAP has done. We feel very proud of our affiliation of this organization, and I know many of you have followed with great interest and care as well. And Vuk, let me congratulate you. This was Vuk's idea many months ago, and like everything he does, this is done with quality and certainly with his passion. And as a result, I think it's going to be a very productive afternoon. So I'll start with the obvious. We live in a very historic and a transformational time. We're experiencing what I would consider a tectonic shift in the world order. The author and journalist, somebody that I'm sure you read as I do quite frequently, Tom Friedman, described the world recently as being redivided into a world of order and a world of disorder. And we don't have an answer yet for the people flocking from the world of disorder into the world of order, now estimated to be 45,000 people every single day. There are four major forces, in my view, for this transformation. The first is Mother Nature. Mother Nature in the form of climate change in particular. We've now reached a level at 400 parts per million of CO2 that the world has not experienced in 20 million years. Biodiversity loss is part of this as well. Experts and scientists tell us, researchers tell us, that 25% of all species that exist today in the world will be gone within the next 40 years. And population growth is a challenge that we still have not been able to embrace and fully anticipate as a result of the rapid growth we've seen just in the last 200 years. In 1800, literally 1 billion people populated the world. In 2050, it will be almost 10. So the first, Mother Nature is having a profound effect on this transformational experience that we're all a part of. The second is Moore's Law, a steady doubling of technological capacity. Technology is changing every single aspect of our lives. The way we live, the way we work, the way we govern, the way we communicate. I was surprised to learn that we now exchange 205 billion email every day. 74 trillion email are now exchanged every year. The third is globalization. We're quickly moving from an interdependence to an integration in the world of order that has produced a chasm between the world of disorder and those of us fortunate enough to live in the world of order. But with an increasing inclination on the part of all sectors in the region to engage globally in a far more intricate and a far more intense way than we've ever experienced at any time in history. The fourth force is the extremist transnational movement in the regions of disorder, but increasingly affecting regions of order, as we've seen in Paris and San Bernardino just in the last month. It has little national geographic identity. The names are now familiar: ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, forcing migration in numbers that we have not seen since World War II. But this transnational movement is also made up of terrorists and hackers with no names, who pose a clear and present danger with threats to cyber and biosecurity unlike anything we've experienced at any time in history. To everyone in the regions of disorder now, but increasingly to regions of order as well. There's nothing really that has prepared us for what we're witnessing and experiencing now. A meltdown of an increasing number of states, all at the same time, all in an increasingly globalized and interdependent world, with fears that it could worsen, particularly as China's domestic struggles continue and it becomes more aggressive with neighbors like Japan and Taiwan in the South China Sea. There are other factors that are also affecting this tectonic shift. The UN estimates that by 2050, the number of migrants who are victims of climate change will exceed an additional 200 million a year. That is an additional 55,000 per day. Food security will also be a major challenge, something that we here at CAP helped address just in the last couple of weeks with a very intense 3-day war game scenario that helped us all better understand the extraordinary challenge of food security as we look to the next 40 years. But the world will need to find a way to produce more food in the next 40 years than it did in the last 4,000. So the challenges are great. And as with so many times in history involving major global or national challenge, it seems to me the key factor in ensuring success in this transformational period especially will be our capacity for leadership, both in government and in the private sector. Leadership that can ensure that we rise to the challenges that I've just outlined. The U.S., throughout the last 230 years, has had an extraordinary success of finding the right leaders at the right time. A Washington, and a Jefferson, and a Lincoln, and a Roosevelt. And as I think of the quality of that leadership, I lament the fact that at just the time when we need the right leadership, as much now as perhaps at any time in our history, Washington has devolved to a level of dysfunction rarely seen in over 2 centuries of history. At its core, it is a philosophical and political debate largely over the role of government. You could call it the noise of democracy, loud, not very stereophonic, difficult to listen to. And one could argue that the noise of democracy certainly beats the alternatives. The noise of violence and death in some parts of the world, or no noise at all, where you're arrested for simply speaking your mind. But this noise has also become a cacophony that is increasingly disturbing in that it is reflecting not only this debate about the role of government, but an enormous frustration about economic stagnation, about global engagement and fatigue driven by 2 wars that have lasted more than a decade without a definitive result, personal insecurity in several contexts, and I must say an increasing and disturbing level of intolerance that our country has witnessed in the past, but at this rate may not have witnessed at this level, at least in my lifetime. The Pew Research Center did a study about a year ago that noted that our country is more divided than it has been at any time in the last 150 years, driven partly by these transformational forces. The election in 2016 will certainly be in part an answer to the question, under these circumstances, what kind of leader will we want? What kind of leader can get us through this transformational time? The choice is likely to be historically stark. Between an outsider like Donald Trump or Ted Cruz with little or no political and governmental experience, which is viewed by some as an asset. And Hillary Clinton, or someone on the Democratic side with decades of experience. Regardless of choice, it seems to me that leadership will be defined by four primary factors. The first is resiliency. As with other challenging times in history, the wars in particular, economic troubles as we experienced with the Great Depression and the most recent Great Recession, resiliency will be critical. There will be unforeseen events, events of hopefully controllable nature, but certainly unforeseen, that could be enormously impactful not only to the American people, but to people around the globe. Our leaders in the past, those leaders that we now look to for inspiration, understood the importance of resiliency. And whether it was a Roosevelt, a Lincoln, a Washington, they had something I call an invincible determination to lead this country through the most challenging and difficult times and cause us to rise up and to meet the challenges of that particular time. We need that kind of leader again. The second quality will be innovation. Never has it been more important. Our country has prided itself in the past with its capacity for innovation. But we have to harness not only the technological revolution with all of the big data implications and empowerment that it brings, but we've got to ensure that our leaders continue to think out of the box. Not to be thinking in the 20th or the 19th century, but to recognize times have changed dramatically, and we need to meet the challenge of these changing times with innovative thinking. The third is collaboration. Global, professional, public, and private. No country, no leader, no one can do this alone. And fourth is engagement. We can't pull back. It's important for us to be engaged and provide the kind of leadership the world has come to depend on. Like many others, I've always subscribed to the 4 Ds. A recognition first of the need for defense and security in these uncertain and dangerous times. The need for diplomacy, the second D, and a recognition that war can be averted in many cases if diplomacy can be given a chance. The third D is development, and a recognition that other countries strive to be better, to grow their economies and to do what they can to ensure that their people too can be empowered economically. And the fourth D is democracy, and a recognition that the people themselves have to be given the chance to make their decisions. It's incumbent on all of us to be engaged, globally, domestically, and perhaps now more than any other time in recent history, politically. I'm troubled by the fact that in the last election in some states, like Kentucky, only 31% of the people bothered to vote. I was recently with a group of students, and I must say, every time I'm invigorated. I walk out of the room more hopeful than I was before I walked in. I was with a group not long ago, and one of the students used a quote that I had seen before, and I think certainly applies in these times. He said, well, difficult takes time. Impossible takes just a little longer. I think we have to take on the challenges we face in this world today with a recognition that while they may seem almost impossible, with some invincible determination, with resiliency, with the kind of engagement and collaboration and innovation we know we're capable of making, we too can address these times as our leaders have done so ably and consistently in the past. With that, I look forward to the conversation. Thank you all very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I want to start by thanking Senator Daschle for this really inspirational introduction. I want to start by saying that it's great to be back in Washington, and it's an enormous privilege to be able to work with the Center for American Progress. And I want to say how grateful I am to the center, to Senator Daschle, to the chair, but also to the president, Madam Tandon, and my friends, my good friends Vikram, Matt, Ken, Nathan. I want to thank you all guys for making this possible. It is a privilege, representing a very, small and a relatively new Serbian think tank to be working with a big Center for American Progress, and especially when it comes to issues like U.S. foreign policy, which is the main topic of our latest edition of the journal. I also want to thank Nira, and I want to thank Ivo. I also want to thank Senator Daschle for making contributions. I think that we have a few more contributors here. I see Branko. I think Ambassador Katz is here as well. Adam Garfinkel. I saw him earlier. Well, thank you very much for making this edition worth reading. Our topic this afternoon is the U.S. foreign policy in 2016 and beyond. There is very little doubt that America is going to remain the world's main geopolitical actor for many more years to come, and as the presidential and other elections are moving to high gear, this is becoming a great topic for the whole world. So today with us, as Vikram said, we do have a think tank summit. We have an awesome lineup, and I'll introduce briefly the participants in the panel. I'm going to start in the order in which they will speak in the first round, so I'll start with Richard. Richard Fontaine is the president of the Center for New American Security, one of DC's most influential bipartisan think tanks, focusing on security and defense policy. He previously served as foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, and also worked at the State Department, National Security Council, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Then we have Martin Indyk, executive vice president of the Brookings Institution and one of America's most distinguished Middle East diplomats. He served previously as a U.S. Special Envoy for the Israel-Palestinian negotiations, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Special Assistant to President Clinton, Senior Director of the National Security Council, and also Assistant Secretary of State. Ivo Dolder, my old friend Ivo, President of the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs and previously U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Also Director of the National Security Council for European Affairs, having worked at Brookings as a senior fellow specializing in American foreign policy, European security, and transatlantic relations. And last but certainly not least is our host for this afternoon, Nira Tandon, president of the Center for American Progress, who previously served in Clinton and Obama administrations. She was Director of Domestic Policy in Obama-Biden presidential campaign, where she managed all domestic policy proposals, but she also played a critical role in the crafting of the historical Affordable Care Act. And she was a longtime advisor for Hillary Clinton in her various capacities. So it's an enormous privilege to chair a panel like this. And I'd like to start with the most conspicuous of all flashpoints in today's world, and this is the Middle East. In the words of also one of the Horizon Settlers who is not here, but was probably known to everybody, Itamar Rabinovich. We are experiencing the great unraveling of the order that was founded about 100 years ago. and evident geopolitical consequences for the U.S. As well as for the American allies throughout the world, and in particular in the region, are ongoing. So it's an enormously complex place, a place where the enemy of your enemy is not guaranteed to be your friend, actually to the opposite. And with the recent developments, Paris attacks, also California shootings, and many, many other developments, it brings this issue to the fore. So I'm going to start by asking Richard about what needs to be done in the next year. I mean, this is the last year of Obama's administration, and President was very eloquent on Sunday, speaking about what is America currently doing and what America plans on doing. But in your opinion, in the next year, in the one last year of Obama's administration, what do you think America needs to do with regard to ISIS and with regard to the Middle East and the waterstands?
Well, thanks, Vuk, and thanks to CAP for having all of us here today. It's great to be here. I think that the United States needs to intensify its fight against ISIS. We are doing a number of things, as the President outlined in his most recent remarks, but it seems the case that the administration believes that time is on our side, and that if we only patiently pursue the course that we're on, then ISIS ultimately will be destroyed. And I don't think time is on our side. I think there's a premium on our ability to prevent ISIS from growing, shrinking its territory, and stopping, or at least significantly diminishing its ability to plan attacks in Iraq, Syria, and Libya that would be conducted elsewhere, including in the United States. And I don't think that that intensification requires the deployment of large-scale ground troops or an invasion of Syria or any of these kinds of things that no one seems to seriously be advocating, but rather a number of steps that could be taken that I think would make the fight more effective. So you could embed American advisors at the brigade or battalion level with Iraqi security forces in Iraq. You could pass weapons to the Kurds and the Sunnis by bypassing Baghdad in Iraq. You could explore the establishment of safe zones along the Turkish and or Jordanian borders in Syria. You could increase the number of special operations forces in Syria and allow them not only to advise troops on the ground, but also to conduct direct action against ISIS. So I think there's a number of things that are well short of the thing that no one seems to want to do again, which is put large numbers of American troops on the ground and then require them to hold territory and then govern that territory or find someone to govern it. But it would significantly intensify and therefore make more effective the fight against ISIS.
Well, there's obviously another factor that entered the equation relatively recently, and that is Russia. Russia is conducting for the first time a military intervention outside of Soviet space after the end of the Cold War. And I'm going to ask Ivo, who's an expert in Russia, what, in your opinion, Russia wants in the Middle East, and in Syria in particular? And is there any scope, given what they want and what their goals are, for America and the Western alliance to work more closely with Russia, especially after the shooting down of the Russian plane by the Turks, which in many ways exacerbated the situation?
Vuk, thanks first of all for your leadership in putting together this journal, and thanks for putting the panel together, and thanks for coming back to Washington. So it's great to be back at CAP and with old colleagues and friends. What Russia wants first and foremost is to maintain its presence in the Middle East. It had a presence in the Middle East before. It had a naval base in Syria. It has now expanded its military presence by having its military forces in the thousands, including and particularly on the air. It's to maintain that capability. It wanted to be there and maintain it. For now, supporting Assad and his government is the means to that end. Assad is the one who invited him, Russia, to come in, It is, according to Russia, the legitimate government, or at least it is the government of Syria, and therefore supporting Assad's capacity to remain in power is the means to the end of staying in the Middle East. That's number one. Number two, in the longer term, I think the Russians recognize that the growth of ISIS poses a direct national security threat to Russia, particularly given its own Muslim population in the Caucasus, and the fact that large numbers of those people who have not yet been radicalized because of the internal fighting that has happened in Russia since the late 1990s, are being radicalized by joining ISIS in large numbers. The numbers are around 2,000 Russian citizens having moved from Russia into the Middle East. And therefore, the destruction of ISIS, at least in the long run, is something that the Russians would like to achieve. The key question for policymakers is, where does the balance lie between the destruction, the need to destroy ISIS on the one hand, and secondly, to maintain the presence of Russia on the other hand? We have conflated those two as being about Assad. That might be the case, but it need not be the case. You could potentially have a situation in which Russia can secure its presence in Syria without necessarily backing Assad. It would have to have some other new government. But that's the goal. And we need to live with that reality, which existed before and has become more explicit since the deployment of Russian troops and air power in the region in last September.
And just as a quick follow-up, do you see any zero-sum game by the Russians, given that their context of engagement with the West is much wider, and there are other theaters of conflagration like Ukraine, and therefore they're kind of trying to act in Syria in order then to be able to extract concessions on other fronts? So
no doubt that the reality that exists both on the ground in Europe and in the Middle East provides Moscow with a form of leverage, which is to say, our willingness to cooperate with you in the Middle East is to some extent dependent on your willingness to cooperate with us in Europe, meaning lifting sanctions when you come right down to it. No one has been falling in that trap yet. I don't see anybody falling into that trap, in part because Russia's commitment to the fight against ISIS is secondary to its commitment in the fight and staying in Syria. I mean, if you look at the bombing patterns, including up to this day, he is going after the opposition of Assad, not after ISIS. And that's after ISIS claimed responsibility for, and Russia agreed it was responsible for, taking down an airplane that killed 220 of their citizens. So under those circumstances, it isn't just ISIS that is really pushing them. And as long as we have this fundamental difference of perspective, the ability to leverage one against the other, by them and by us, is limited.
Well, thanks for this. And I'm going to now move to Martin, because a lot of people believe that this is most to do with tactics. Russian playing now and maybe changing their game in the future, and when it comes to strategy, that the real strategic game changer in the Middle East was actually the nuclear deal with Iran, which is undoubtedly a great diplomatic success by Washington. It was supported by most of the world, including the other permanent members of the Security Council, and Russia actually played a constructive role there. We may not see Russia playing a constructive role in the future on other Middle Eastern issues. But Washington did come across somewhat divided on the deal.
That's
I
fair.
mean, I'm just saying.
I think that's fair.
From the outside perspective, somewhat divided it was. But anyway, this deal is now on, and what's your opinion? What's going to be the strategic repercussion of the Iran deal if it holds, or in case Iranians back on it?
Well, thanks, Vuk. Thanks very much for having
me on this panel. It's great to be back at CAP. I wasn't sure whether this is a Netanyahu seat or not.
That was a throne.
But I'm delighted to be here. Look, isn't it interesting how Iran has kind of disappeared from the discussion? And that's partly because the debate about the Iranian nuclear deal was so intense and absorbed so much oxygen that once the deal was done, kind of people needed to move on. It's also a function of this transaction that has been done between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is essentially Israel gets a new 10-year military assistance deal at higher levels, still to be negotiated, in return for backing off on the actual deal and no longer attacking it. So that also has helped to lower the temperature. But what I think that disguises is the fact that Iran hasn't changed its regional policies. What's happened is that the nuclear issue has, for the time being, off the radar screen. I hope that's turns out to be for 15 years. We're going to have to be very, very vigilant about Iranian compliance with the agreement. But it does reinforce a point that I think President Obama made throughout this debate about the Iranian deal, which is that, because there's so much else going on in the region, so much turmoil and so much descent into chaos, as Senator Daschle was explaining, taking the potential for a nuclear arms race in the Middle East off the table just makes it somewhat easier to deal with those other issues and to focus on those other issues. But Iran hasn't changed its regional policies. And in particular, Iran's policy in Syria is something that we're not focusing on, essentially because Russia has taken all the oxygen out of that issue, but it's still there. And if you look across the region, Iran has, I think, either done something very clever or simply been the beneficiary of Saudi stupidity. But either way, the Saudi decision to take the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, with the exception of Oman, into Yemen on the grounds that Iran is presenting a threat there by its support for the Houthis, has represented a great sinkhole for 50% at least of their military capacity. And in the meantime, why is that a problem? Is because when we look in the Syria arena, we can't win the battle against ISIS unless we do it with Sunnis. It's a basic principle. I think it's not that complicated. We can't use Iran and Shias, Alawites, Assad and Russia, because Russia's aligned with that camp, as Ivo points out, to defeat ISIS, because all that will do will exacerbate the sectarian war. So we have to do it with Sunnis. We have to do it with Sunnis because we are not going to put a vast army in there to destroy ISIS. And that's partly because of the war weariness and war weariness of the American people, but it's also because of a kind of recognition, you could read about it in the New York Times yesterday, that that's exactly what ISIS wants in their apocalyptic end of days notion. They want to drag us into that. So hopefully we're smarter than that this time around. But that puts further emphasis on the need for Sunni boots on the ground, whether it's Sunni tribes in Iraq or whether it's Sunni forces in Syrian Sunni forces in Syria, or whether it's Sunni Gulf states, and I don't include Egypt in this because they've got their own problems, but there's a Turkish army, a Turkish Sunni army on the border there, and it's a NATO ally, and it has a stake in this. So it's not as if the capabilities aren't there if we work on it. It includes, to some extent, the Iraqi army, but I wouldn't bet on that. So how do we get the Sunni component of this in place, because that's the missing piece. Richard's absolutely right. We can step up these things, and that'll have, I think, a marginal effect, but it's not going to make a difference in the end. What's going to make the difference is whether we've got Sunni forces there to take the territory back from ISIS. And here comes the complicated part of it. Excuse me for going on for so long. The complicated part of it is the Sunni forces that are there do not regard ISIS as their first priority. It's mostly Assad that is their first priority. Turks also want to fight the Kurds, but I think there's a chance that we can get them off that. But it's Assad, and that's why we have to shift the priorities. At this point, the priority of American policy is ISIS first, and we'll deal with Assad through some kind of diplomatic daring do in which, somehow we're going to get everybody to agree that Assad should go. Well, that ain't going to happen. It's only going to happen if we fight Assad as if there were no ISIS and fight ISIS as if there were no Assad. And by supporting the Sunnis against Assad, we can turn around to them and say, you need to support us against ISIS.
Very quickly for 2016, do you think that there is any hope that there might be a revival of the peace process, or do you think that there is any risk for this thing going terribly wrong,
No.
like a third intifada, something exploding?
I think there is potential for the Palestinian Authority to collapse, and that will put Israel in a very difficult situation, and that in the end could lead to a much hotter third intifada as opposed to the low-level intifada we see, a kind of personal intifada that we're seeing at the moment. But I think that Secretary Kerry gave a speech at the Sabah Forum at Brookings on the weekend, which was his diplomatic way of doing what we call a baker. The baker is, when you guys are serious, here's my phone number.
I see.
He didn't quite say it that way, but that's what he meant.
Well, thank you. I'm going to now ask Nera. In your Horizons essay, you argue very forcefully that reversing the trends of rising inequality and shrinking social mobility in the U.S. represents one of the key challenges of our time for American government. Well, in poll after poll, Americans rank economy as their single greatest concern. So what we discussed here, how is American progress affected by what happens in the Middle East? And do you think that in the years to come, under new president, is the Middle East going to remain a strategic priority? And if so, how much of a priority is it going to remain for the future American administration?
So, I often think of the expression from The Godfather when I think of this question about American leadership in the Middle East, which is, no matter how much you try to leave, it always brings you back in. And so, to me, I think there's really two issues here. One, as we've seen in the instance of Syria, issues around Syria have only grown in importance because the issue of Syria itself is expanding from Syria through the refugee crisis into Europe and ultimately into conversations in the United States. Issues in the Middle East around ISIS and its power are bifurcating from territory issues to terrorism, which is definitely affected Europe through the Paris attacks and is evidenced in some indirect, it seems at this point, way in the San Bernardino attacks. So, I think the Middle East is more and more on the minds of Americans, but I think my own view is that how we respond to these issues are deeply affected by economics within the United States, and what I mean by that is, if you can look at the country today, in the United States, look at both political parties. And they are, I believe, both responding to issues around 15 years of wage stagnation in the United States. So Democrats in the United States are increasingly focused on inequality, wage stagnation, issues around fairness in the economy, more so than at any period of the last 20 years. And on the Republican Party, I think you can even look at the rhetoric of the last few days and see that there is a deep anxiety about people who are different. So over the summer it was immigration, but the collision of these issues between the Middle East, terrorism, and the Republican debate is what we're seeing with these virulent, disgusting, in my view, attacks on Muslims in the United States and around the world, which have the effect of actually helping ISIS's strategy, but let's put that aside. So, my own view is that politics in the United States is getting disrupted at a increasing velocity and becoming more and more disruptive, and that a lot of Americans are turning inward from economic issues, which is an old conversations we've had. But the rise of terrorism and effects of terrorism within the United States are having very disjointed impacts on the political conversation. And, I deeply worry that if you look at, I'll just say it out loud, Donald Trump's support amongst working class voters is what's driving this debate. Working class voters have had a 20% reduction in their income over the last 20 years. They've been negatively affected by economic dislocation. And I think that is driving their anxiety about a host of issues. Economic populism on one hand, anti-trade on another, but very much anti-immigrant and these other issues. So, but I think for any political leader in 2017, 2018, 2019, and into the foreseeable future, the United States, regardless of how many Americans want to turn inward, has no choice but to exemplify leadership in the arena of the Middle East, because the alternatives will mean that choices will be made for us. We will not make those choices. They will be made for us, and they will be worse. I think that is something we have learned, at least in the last few years, about Syria. They always get worse. They never get better. So not making choices doesn't make things better, seems to me, is the right way to approach these issues. So I think that these issues, the Middle East will be a dominant issue this year. It'll be a dominant issue into the next president's term, and whoever that president is will have to realize that's only solving these problems will take them off the front pages of the New York Times every day.
Well, thanks. I think this was very well put. But there's another theater which many people expect will be a theater of crisis in 2016, and that is our main ally, Europe and European Union. There's so many things that are currently going on in the political life of the European Union that are giving reasons for concern. There's a British referendum that's going to take place in the next 12 or so months. Europe is struggling with the inflow of refugees, and there is an ongoing conundrum in Ukraine. So Europe seemed to be struggling. And my question to you, Eva, would be, apart from the TTIP, which may or may not happen in this administration, we'll see. You argue very forcefully for the TTIP in your Horizons article, and many people do in Europe. But apart from the TTIP, what is it that America can do to assist Europe in 2016? And first and foremost, do you expect difficulties in Europe in 2016, and how can America help Europe if they occur?
I think the crisis in Europe is about as bad as it has been, certainly in my lifetime and probably since the end of World War II. And the crisis involves the institutions of the European Union first and foremost, that are now under direct challenge by what is happening in this part of the world. Just think about it. 1 million refugees have just landed in Germany. 1 million. We're having a debate about 20,000. They had 1 million refugees. There are 20,000 refugees a day entering in Greece alone, and they are finding their way to the rest of Europe. So the refugee crisis is overpowering the institutions. Most important institution in Europe is the freedom of travel, and that institution is under direct attack. 7 years now, after the economic crisis, our ability, or Europe's ability, to kick the can down the road on the Eurozone crisis is going to come to an end. At some point, a fundamental decision will have to be made about how you transfer resources from one part of the Union to the other part of the Union, or the Union will break apart on that particular issue. Both these issues are going to be at the heart of the debate in Britain about whether or not it is going to remain a member of the European Union, where I think the outcome is by no means certain, even if the political class is moving increasingly in the direction of trying to figure out how to stay in. There is unpredictability. And we're seeing politically, as a result of these factors, and I haven't even mentioned the Russian challenge posed to Ukraine, but as a result of these challenges, you see a political reaction that we're seeing here too. Marie Le Pen, whose rhetoric may come with a better smile than we are seeing in this country, just won 30% of the vote in France after the terrorist attack. My own country, in the Netherlands, the Freedom Party is now polling at 1/4 of the vote. The total number of seats of Mr. Wilders, if you didn't know about him, he just wrote a piece in the New York Times on this, but his total vote, the number of seats, is the same as the two governing parties in opinion polls. So that's the politics in your region more, in Hungary and in Poland, leads to a growth of nationalism that is taking down what is happening in Europe. This matters. I think the piece that I co-authored in Horizon is about why it matters. This country has gone to war twice, in 1914, in 1917, and in 1941, to prevent the disintegration and takeover of Europe. We regarded in 1917 and 1941, and again in 1945 until today, that the viability of Europe is fundamental to our own prosperity, security, and identity of who we are. So we have a real stake in Europe succeeding. It's a market, it's our strongest allies, they're the people who share our values, and we need to be present in the effort for that Europe to succeed. And it may come as a surprise to Europeans, but without the United States, they haven't succeeded in the past. It may come as a surprise to Americans to realize that without the United States, Europe is unlikely to succeed. So my big worry, and it's a concern that I have, are we able as a country to focus on the Middle East, which we need to do given what's happening, in part because it keeps coming back, as Neera said, to, oh, by the way, focus on Asia, which is the largest, strongest, most important growing economy in the world, while not forgetting about Europe, because we're needed in Europe too. That's the challenge, if I want to put it to Senator Daschle. The challenge of leadership is our ability to walk, chew, and run at the same time, because we need to have an Asian strategy that makes sense. We need to have a Middle East strategy that deals with the problems of the Middle East. And we need a European strategy before it's too late. And right now, I'm afraid that we think we can focus on the Middle East and sort of hope that the rest of it will find its way. And these things have a way of coming back at you, to paraphrase Neera again on The Godfather. And you know, last time Europe was a mess, it wasn't a pretty picture. And we don't want to repeat that either.
Well, thanks. But before moving on to the big chunk of foreign policy discourse, which is Asia, I'd like to stay for a second on the issue of refugees, because this is really shaking the European construct, not only in the European Union, also in a part of Europe where I come from, which is just on the borderland, and that happens to be the main transit route. And people are now talking about raising walls and with all kinds of repercussions that raising walls in Europe may bring. But I'm gonna ask Nira about this refugee thing, because it's something that has obviously caused a lot of emotion in the political discourse here in this country. And we're not really talking about even the same order of magnitude as what Europe is trying to go through. And I remember you saying once that in the past, America had a closed door policy to Cuban refugees. Maybe some of the people who are now running for office may have not been necessarily in a position to do so. But why do you think that here in this country it's such a huge issue, given the history? I mean, maybe I'm naive. I mean, I'm coming from a part of the world which has always seen America as a place which is open, which was built on immigration, which was open to everybody from everywhere in the world. Why do you think that right now America's seem to be shutting down?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, it's always kind of embarrassing to talk about the kind of conflagration around Syrian refugees when we're talking about 0 to 65,000, as Jordan has dealt with 1 million. Sweden is taking in so many. Germany, France will continue to take in refugees. I think it is actually a continuation of the point I was making earlier, which is that is a flashpoint around concerns about terrorism and, my view, fear of Muslims and kind of Islamophobia that's energizing it. I mean, the reality in the United States is that every wave of refugees we've taken in, from Cuban refugees to Iranian refugees to Vietnamese refugees, have all been, huge contributors to our society and contribute a lot economically. But I think there's just a real fear. Americans are particularly anxious these days, and there's kind of a mixture of fear of Islam. People don't really understand it. They think of a lot of the Syrians as I don't think they're thinking of the Christian Syrians as much as you see in the rhetoric and debate as Muslim Syrians, and I think that's just really the kind of, you're hitting a powder keg of election period, and we have candidates running who are running in very conservative places that are very homogeneous. My own experience in those states is there aren't a lot of people of color of any different faith in the states that people are running in, Iowa and New Hampshire right now. And so it is a little bit of a toxic mix of concerns about terrorism, Islamophobia, and really just a basic fear of the other. And I don't know if we'd have this same debate a year from now or a year ago, but we are in this particular moment of a presidential primary debate where people are very much shifting directly right. Would all of these governors have gone into this kind of xenophobic direction if we didn't have a presidential primary on the Republican side? I don't really know.
Can I just jump in on the refugee issue? Because, before the refugee crisis in Europe, the flood of refugees into Europe, we were dealing with the massive refugee crisis that already existed coming out of Syria in a way in which there was no debate about
Yeah.
our taking more. We weren't taking very many. We gave a lot of money, $4.5 billion to Jordan and to Lebanon to absorb these refugees. And it's by no means perfect, but amazingly, despite all the great concern that we had that these refugees would destabilize these two countries, so far, it's okay. Amazingly,
Yeah.
especially in the case of Lebanon. So I think that on the one hand, it's terrible. We should be doing a lot more. We should be taking a lot more. But now the political environment has become so toxic that it's hard to imagine that's going to happen. I just think we should be doing that. But the answer still really does lie in trying to work harder at keeping them in the region as long as they can be protected in terms of humanitarian issues. And that's why I think rather than trying to take on the debate about keeping them here, we need to be focused on creating safe havens over there.
Or, ultimately solving the problem of Syria would be helpful.
Yeah, well,
they'll
no,
be
but
actually
along the
half
way,
full.
because
Yeah.
that's not going to come soon, we need to have safe havens there. That, if we're not going to take them here, we should take on the responsibility of making it safe for them there in Syria.
Richard, for example, because I know that you have experience in dealing with policy issues related to the Middle East. We're all talking about eventually we solve this, and it reminds me in many ways about on the Yugoslav crisis in the 1990s, and eventually there was a strong American push to end the war in Bosnia, and it ended in 1995. And, with the benefit of hindsight, I could think of, why did it not end in 93 or in 94? It could have happened earlier. So my question is, what would accelerate? Is there anything that will accelerate the international community coming together, perhaps under American leadership, perhaps facilitated by America? When is that going to happen? Is it going to happen? Do we have to wait for the new administration for this to happen?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, more terrorist attacks on the West is going to be the galvanizing factor here. If you look at even the steps that have been relatively incremental in terms of escalation, they've been in response either to an attack or the perception that attacks were more likely. And, the root cause of this is the civil war in Syria right now, right? I mean, it's not a coincidence in the four countries that are engulfed in civil war right now in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, Al-Qaeda and or ISIS has a presence in all of them. You can't deal with Al-Qaeda or ISIS and these attacks without dealing with the underlying causes of the civil war. Whether that can be resolved is a wholly separate issue, but nevertheless, you got to deal with that. But because it looks so difficult, because it requires so much over such a long period of time trying to bring this to resolution, there has not been the catalytic event to sort of bring everybody behind and reshape their calculation of interest in doing this. And I'm afraid that it may be terrorist attacks either in the United States and or in Europe that bring us in that direction. Therefore, we should do now what we would do after an attack with one caveat: do it without the fear and panic that we will have and the sense of vulnerability we'll have in the immediate aftermath of an attack, where, as we and other democracies tend to do, we will find something to do, we will find somewhere to go. We should take those steps now.
Can I just add to that, though? I mean, I do think in the Middle East, we can't divorce both the conception of policy leaders and the public from the experience we have had in the Middle East. I mean, I think it's always fascinating to me to talk about Iranian aims in the Middle East when Iranian aims in the Middle East have been heavily aided by what we did in Iraq. So I have to say we do have to think through, and I take Martin's point very seriously. We have to do, it's really great. I am as frustrated as anyone in the inaction or the inability for the United States to affect events in Syria to its policy goals. At the same time, I appreciate, Martin's statement, and I agree with them that putting troops on the ground is what ISIS wants. So given this complicated scenario we find, which has been even more complicated by Russia's involvement, I think it's really incumbent for us to think through. Of course, we all want a resolution, but exactly how you achieve those ends, taking very seriously. We can obviously do more at the margins of embedding troops, American troops, et cetera. But I think in the large scheme of things, Americans are cognizant of the fact that we invaded a country. We put a lot of boots on the ground. It has seemed to have gone very badly for our ends and has strengthened many of the people we see as policy opponents in the region, namely Iran. And so I think that is creating a sense of wariness, not just amongst policymakers, but the public.
Just to follow, I don't think that's actually a constraint on the president's action in any way. I mean, in 2007, all the polls showed that Americans wanted troops to come home from Iraq. A majority in the House and the Senate voted for withdrawal resolutions on the floor to bring American troops home, and President Bush actually increased the number of troops in Iraq, despite the fact that what the American people wanted as dictated by the polls and what the Congress had. And in the white-hot debate over Iraq, withdrawal never got 60 votes on the floor of the Senate to force the president to do the opposite of what he believed needed to be done, and it certainly wouldn't have gotten 67 to override a presidential veto. So if President Obama decided tomorrow that whatever steps that we're envisioning here needed to be done, despite the fact that America's war-weary and the Congress may not support it, I don't think that they can do anything to constrain him meaningfully.
Yeah, no. My point is, I'm taking the policy point, the substantive point, which is, how do we directly affect events in Syria? If you think that that actually ISIS wants a ground invasion from the United States, and when we can't in fact make the Sunnis be the frontal part. So my point is, it would be good for us to be clear about what those particular actions are, given the constraints we've all discussed.
Well, I had great ambitions about 20 minutes ago
Asia.
to pivot to Asia, but that's not going to happen unless the audience
I think what
decides.
happened to the pivot in Asia is the same thing.
The same thing that happened here.
Actually,
I
it's been
think this is
instructive.
actually
Well said.
very true.
It's a good
But maybe the audience forces us to pivot to Asia. But we have 15 to 20 minutes, which is open for the Q&A from the audience. So the floor is yours, sir.
Jaap van Wezen from the Jerusalem Report. I just came from a meeting from the Middle East Institute where they had a public opinion poll by Zogby, what's happening in the Arab world. And one of the questions was whether the Arab public is in favor of an Arab force that would, an Arab ground force in Syria and Iraq against ISIS. And the answer was overwhelming yes, which is of course not being translated into policy, but the people who commented there said it might be ground for the US or behind the scenes to try to get something going among Arab leaders, given that the Arab public certainly would not oppose it, but in fact would be in favor of that. What do you think about that?
Who are you asking? Martin.
Well, it's an interesting poll. But as you know, Yup, they're not democracies, and they don't. The leaders out there don't tend to take their lead from public opinion. But if it is an indication that in the Arab world there is a growing understanding of the threat that ISIS poses to their own young people and to their own societies, then it's a very good thing and should make the case of getting the Sunni states to lead this effort on the ground. Then that's great, and we should definitely listen to the people. do it as a matter of course anyway. In this case, we should do that.
Especially when they're right.
Yeah, that's right.
Sure. Dear.
Yes, my name is Edward Lazansky, American University in Moscow. News came this morning that Secretary Kerry is going to Moscow. And do you have any inside information if this is kind of a change in U.S. policy? Are they going to have alliance with Russia that Putin wants, or anything else? Just what is your indication of this trip? Thank you.
Anyone with inside information?
If we had it, this
Like
wouldn't
to
be the
share
right.
group?
I think Secretary Kerry has, for many months now, made very clear that he is interested in working with whatever party in the region and beyond to try to figure out a way to come to a political process that, if not solve, at least moves us towards a solution in Syria. And he has had many, many conversations with Foreign Minister Lavrov. In fact, he went to Sochi, if you remember, and met with President Putin about 4 months ago and had a long discussion about it. The presidents had a meeting at the G20 meeting in Turkey and again on the margins of the Paris COP22 to 21 meeting. So there is a political process ongoing. It started in Vienna. It's moving, I believe, to New York next week. And as part of that, as is Secretary Kerry's want, he goes around and tries to talk to as many people as he can to try to figure out a way to move from A to B. And so I would assume, and I don't know anything, in fact, first time I heard about it, but I assume that the reason he's going to Moscow is because it's easier to have that conversation there than wherever else it would need to take place.
I just add, I don't have any inside information. I wouldn't share it with you if I did, but I think that the challenge for Secretary Kerry is to pry Putin away from Assad. That's critical to the whole game plan in Syria. He can't do that unless he respects the kinds of things that Ivo was talking about. I think I would say that number one concern for Putin when it comes to that kind of conversation with Secretary Kerry is what happens the day after, or more in particular, the moment after Assad goes. Because his big fear, and it's not an unreasonable fear, is that chaos will follow the departure of Assad. And chaos for Putin is more of a problem than it is for Obama, because that's in his neighborhood. And that can affect Chechens and others in his country. So that is something, there needs to be a dialogue at the top level between the United States and Russia about what happens the day after. If we can find a way, working with the Russians, to reassure them that in fact the day after will not lead to chaos, then we've got a chance of moving Putin away from Assad.
Branko, you're one of the authors in Horizons.
Thank you, Branko Terzic, a non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. Staying in the region, I returned from Europe yesterday. There was an article in one of the press about Angela Merkel looking to keep critical NATO information from Turkey. Sort of bizarre article. It may have been in the Eastern European press. I don't remember. But a real question has to do with Turkey. Is the Turkey-Russia dispute a NATO dispute, or is it purely Turkey-Russia? And how do you think things can move forward there in a positive manner?
So the Turkey-Russia dispute is not formally a NATO dispute, but Turkey is a NATO member. Its airspace is, in fact, while nationally defended at the moment, is integrated in the NATO airspace. So all airspace of NATO countries work on an integrated air defense and airspace management system that is controlled by and run by NATO. Any armed attack in retaliation for example, for what the Turks did in shooting down this airplane, would almost inevitably lead to NATO becoming involved. It was why, and by the way, one of the reasons the Turks went to NATO was to say, listen, there was an airplane that was in our collective airspace. I think there is a concern in the corridors of power that the Turks may escalate or pull us into a direction that no one wants, which is a confrontation with Russia that goes beyond this particular airplane or this particular piece of airspace. I mean, personally, I think this was this was an accident waiting to happen. It's only surprising that it took 18 months for something like this to happen. But it's an opportunity, and an opportunity that, in fact, the NATO foreign ministers took last week to say, listen, we really need to start to talk to the Russians at the right kind of military and even political level to start having the kinds of conversations that we used to have in a routine basis during the Cold War, not to resolve the differences that we have, which we need to do where we can, but not within this context, but to make sure that we don't do something stupid or escalate from accidents. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind, none, that the Russians knew exactly what they were doing when they were flying that airplane through Turkish airspace. None. And they've been doing it all along. And it was not, in that sense, it was nothing different. And they did it one time too many. I don't think they'll be doing it again.
Can I say one thing about Turkey, just very briefly, which is I do think one of the we always focus on Syria and whole host of challenges in the Middle East, but you know the declining reliability of Turkey over the last several years from the beginning of this administration to where it is now, and you know the ability for it to play a positive role and the potential that it could have and what it actually is doing from Iraq and the Kurds into Syria, or the lack of what it's doing in Syria, is really a really challenging problem for policymakers around the globe. And the ability for us to have a more reliable situation there would be an almost infinite improvement in our ability to affect events in a positive direction. And it's really an unfortunate situation.
And what do you make out of this Iraqi government's now plea to NATO and to the UN that their territorial integrity is violated by the deployment of Turkish troops in parts of the Iraqi territory? I mean, why is that happening? And if Iraq's government maintains its insistence that Turkey withdraws, what do you think would be NATO allies' reaction to this request by Iraq?
I just wish they would say the same thing about the deployment of Iranian troops to Iraq. But, you know, hope springs eternal.
Well, but it is partly for that reason. The Iranians
exactly. Don't like the Turkish
don't
troops
like
there.
the Turkish troops there. So that's I think part of the reason. But I think it's also that the Iraqi government there's a long history of concern about Turkish territorial ambitions in Iraq, and it goes back to the Ottoman Empire. And so I think that's also what you're seeing there. And the Turk, I mean, there's one dimension of this that I haven't seen get a lot of attention, and that is the Turkmen connection here. The Russians were bombing Turkmen positions in Syria, Syrian Turkmen. They're ethnically Turkish, and I think that was part of the reason that plane was shot down, was to protect them. And you got the same thing going on in Iraq as well. So this is just another dimension of the complexities of the alliances in the region.
Adam, maybe we pivot to Asia after all.
Yeah, finally. But I don't want to get into Asia. But I'd like to ask China's role in the Middle East crisis. Are they helping some helpful hands, or they hope U.S. will be drawn in that part of the region, so they don't have enough time for Asia.
And
Joanne Chen from Taiwan.
if you look at China's role in the Middle East over the past few years, it's moving a little bit in the direction of increased involvement. So for the first time ever, the PLA Navy evacuated Chinese nationals from Libya in a military operation after the fall of Gaddafi. Did the same thing in Yemen when the civil war really exploded there. Those were unprecedented military operations, and it's on the low end. Obviously, this was a humanitarian kind of thing. But if you look at their development of a base in Djibouti, which is not terribly far from the Middle East, then that is significant in a security way. But it's also been the economic side of things and the increased hydrocarbons that are flowing in the direction of not just China, but Korea and Japan as well, and not westward through the Atlantic Ocean as much anymore. And China's increased economic role in the Middle East, I think, is the bigger part of the story. The real question is, I think for the Chinese, can they avoid picking sides? Can they avoid getting bogged down? Can they avoid, can they be friends with Iran, and can they be friends with Israel, and can they be friends with the Saudis and all this other stuff without taking strong stands and sort of make money everywhere and have good relations? And so far, I think they have been able to do that, but over the long run, maybe not.
They've only been able to do that by freeloading on the United States when it comes to protecting their interests in the free flow of oil from the Gulf at reasonable prices, which is now a vital interest of theirs and a not so vital interest of ours. And so, it's ironic that we're all spun up about, with good reason, I think, about their activities in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. If they actually were prepared to partner with us in the Gulf, we might actually welcome that. Ironically, we wouldn't see that as a big strategic move to try to expand their influence, but rather a common interest in protecting the free flow of oil. But they're not prepared to do it.
So I would just say on this
And,
very
and a
quickly-
lot of allies in Asia would feel pretty nervous about that, perhaps.
I mean, I would say we have a Track 2 dialogue with China, and we've actually tried to push this issue. I think their kind of strategic response is that they've played they feel like they've played a helpful role on the Iran nuclear deal. That was more than that was a leadership role that is newer for them. We've made the precise point that in terms of economic interests, China's economy, which is still much more manufacturing based than ours is much more service based, much more reliant on Middle Eastern oil flows. But as Martin's saying, I think if they don't have to get involved because we are, then it's something that's easier for them. I mean, the big question over the next 10, 20 years is, you have a real zero sum in the Middle East between Sunni and Shia forces, it seems. And when there's only one external actor like the United States and Western countries, can there be a very constructive role for a non-Western country like China to balance our actions? And I think that's a big question. But if they don't have to be involved at this point, they don't feel the need.
One last question, because we have time for one more question. Goes to the lady there.
Hi, I'm Naseba Yunus. I'm the Senior Iraq Fellow at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to push you, Mr. Fontaine, a bit further on your recommendations for ratcheting up our response to ISIS. You've talked about directly arming Sunnis and Kurds in Iraq, and we have seen an attempt this year to insert that language in the National Defense Authorization Act, and of course it caused an absolute uproar in Baghdad. And it could go so far as to lead to the overthrow of an already very fragile Prime Minister Abadi. Do you think it would be worth destabilizing the Iraqi government to that extent in order to really bolster the roles that Sunnis can play in this fight?
Yeah, I think that you could do that without overthrowing the government in Baghdad. I think the way to do this would be to say that we're going to supply weapons directly to the Kurds and to Sunni tribes in the West, but that we will go through Baghdad, when Baghdad can ensure the pipeline is efficient, that it actually gets to them, and that they move forward with their National Guard legislation to actually bring into the formal fold of security services the Sunnis, particularly in the West, because only at the end of the day you're going to have a Iraq that can sort of stand up for itself if the government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And so it's a means to both deal directly with ISIS, but also to get some political leverage over the government in Baghdad to make these changes that we've been pushing them to do, but in the absence of any real leverage over them right now. So that would be my approach.
Well, thank you very much. They say that a really good quality discussion about the Middle East has to leave you more confused than at the beginning, and that certainly is the case with me. So I want to.
How about more depressed?
More depressed for sure. In my case, more confused as well. I want to thank everybody, and I want to thank you for joining us. It's been an excellent discussion. It's been a great privilege to work with a Center for American Progress and to work with all of you guys, and I hope that we'll be seeing more of each other in the future. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for coming, and join me in thanking our panelists.
Yeah, that's great.